Good morning, everybody, and welcome to a fascinating discussion around CX with our good friends from Joulica. I'm Tom Lewis. I'm the SVP of Consulting, Analytics, and AI at TTEC Digital. We are the CX leader in consulting and technology, and with me today is Tony McCormack, founder and CEO of Joulica. Now, Tony is the co-founder and CEO, but was previously R&D leader for Avaya, and also leadership positions in a number of startups and multinationals, as well as having a PhD in engineering from the University of Warwick, and holds, get this, 80 analytics, customer experience, and communication patents. If that's the case, Tony, how on earth do you run a business? Welcome.
We'll find out. Thank you very much, Tom. It's really, really a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So I'm pretty confident that a number of our listeners do not know about Joulica. So maybe you could start out just with the headline, give us the Twitter feed relative to what Joulica is and does.
Yeah, sure. So I think you mentioned in your introduction that the co-founders and myself, we were with Avaya for many years, and we led R&D activities there. And prior to establishing Joulica, we saw really strong signals that a combination of data and cloud, huge transformations and huge technology improvements in both those areas were going to really transform contact center. And we could see that progressive organizations were already starting to, make investments in CX rather than just purely efficiency improvements and cost savings type projects. So that's where we placed our bets, and that's where gave birth to Joulica, I guess. And since then, we've focused on a lot of technology building, and for the last number of years, we've been commercially scaling out our solution in the customer service domain predominantly, and allowing customers to benefit from real-time analytics to improve predominantly customer journeys. That's where we see the big focus, and that's starting to be reflected now in the market as well in terms of the recognition that customer journeys is really front and center in improving the overall customer experience.
Yeah, well, and so taking that unstructured data and providing insights and impact around it, historically, and I will say, maybe 5 years ago, it was a lot of speech analytics, tagging and sort of narrow perspective on things. And now with a more generative or large language model kind of assessment, you can really get some insights into it. But give me some insight into where you think the analytics market is going. And here's specifically my question. There are a number of people that I talk to who are considering buying analytics tools in general, who think that the answer will be handed to them on a silver platter. I literally had that conversation this week. And it still requires a human component, I think. Is that true? Will that always be the case? Where do you see that going from the future?
Yeah, I think it's definitely the case now, the human component part of what you were saying there. I think particularly with large language models and generative AI use cases, safe automation and trusted use cases, use of those types of technologies will appear over the coming years. And you can also see the hyper cloud providers starting to provide more guardrail type technologies and capabilities in that area to kind of solve for that trusted AI component. Because really, I think the only production use cases that you could safely bring generative AI into a customer contact center is now where there's a human in the loop. On the silver palette or platter point, it's still a very complex area. I think technology solutions are there for simple journeys that are maybe on a single channel, and even those can be very complex because for a large organization, they probably account for the majority of interactions they have with their customers. They're largely transactional, and even automating those and delivering a really pleasurable experience to the customers can be very complex. And so technology, I think, has got to the point where that will become mainstream. But once you get beyond those simple transactional use cases, it's still a very complex problem. And I think that's where the next waves of innovation. So, you can now, you're willing to invest in a lot of technology to build a very bespoke solution, obviously handle very complex journeys occurring over different channels. I think in 2 to 3 years' time, that will become much more of an out-of-the-box solution provided by technology providers, going to that silver platter thing, but we're a bit away from that yet.
Yeah. Well, and the use cases go wide and far into an organization. And so, the idea that the insights you gather influence, let's say, product development, marketing, sales, beyond just the CX in the care center is one thing. And so from that perspective, there's some intellect around that. Let me shift gears on you a little bit. I think when people think about analytics in customer service broadly, there's sort of, I don't know, a gate they have to walk through, which is, all right, we're going to do this analytics thing and we're going to build a program around it, and it can get very heavy very quickly. And so let's say they go at least part of the way down that path, and their objective, per the title of this webinar, around CX, what's the high notes relative to early and fast wins around the insights you tend to see in the care center that are specific around really fixing customer experience? Any high notes or thoughts that, like this just comes out almost every time we talk to a client?
Yeah, well, I think certainly we would take the approach that you really have to start with start with obviously an iterative approach, but start with a very strong use case which will deliver a quick return on investment. If it always helps if the key stakeholders that own the data, because there's always data challenges and data silos and data ownership problems. I think getting some success early is always critical. And I think the use case that's defined, whether it's an increase in digital self-service, or whether the use case is much more business oriented, like increasing customer retention, all of the KPIs that need to be derived and the data sources that will allow those KPIs to be high fidelity will all derive from identifying those use cases. But as you go up that ladder, going from optimizing digital self-service up to maybe a customer retention, the scope of the problem really widens, and hence I think I would encourage everyone to take baby steps first, to get some successes and to demonstrate that early to all the executives and stakeholders, and then build from there. And really, I think we've seen time and time again the number one problem is data ownership and getting the right data into the domain and the problem and allowing those KPIs to start flowing. So, that would be, that's the most predominant driver of success, I would say, that we would encourage early on.
Got it. And so you use the word data ownership. I often talk about data hygiene and the idea that, it's sort of all over the place. Let's go a little bit deep for a second and talk about what are the typical challenges and what are the best practices around the data aspect of this, because I think you'll also probably say garbage in, garbage out. But part of the advantage of the unstructured data part of the whole analytics is that you're a little bit better off than you were in the past around the garbage. But in any case, so data hygiene and that sort of perspective.
Yeah, well, I think there is certainly no magic solution to data hygiene. I think you mentioned generative AI. We see lots of cases where large language models are using to do automated data mapping, but I think that probably gets you 80% there. There's always a need for, just rolling up your sleeves and really making sure the data is fit for purpose to generate clean and reliable metrics and KPIs, particularly if you're going to bring them into an automated use case where you're actually driving adaptive systems based on these metrics. I think where we operate, I think it's particularly difficult because it's well established, most large organizations now are investing in a data strategy where there's a data lake. We see, variations of a data lake strategy and architecture being rolled out. What we try and encourage is real-time data streaming. And that's particularly challenged because a data lake is perfect if you want to generate reports and business intelligence. And hence the data is, maybe a day old if you're really lucky. the pipeline to get reliable data into a data lake to generate insights is, a day is you're doing well at that point. What we try and do is to publish data onto real-time data buses to allow next best action, to allow orchestration, to allow predictive models to start orchestrating these experiences. And I think fundamentally at the moment, that just means that the use cases have to be picked very, very carefully, where you're starting from a point where the data is relatively clean. Now, to your point about one thing we have seen, and I'm sure you've seen it as well, is that speech analytics and transcription, that has come on so much now, in that, intent prediction is far more reliable than it used to be, particularly if you seed it with some domain expertise. And so 4 or 5 years ago, the problem of cleansing interaction data was huge, whereas that's less of a problem now. And it's almost a utility, which is really fascinating, because that means the data that the customer service center owns now is really the crown jewels. It can really be mined reliably and at scale. And I think that in itself is leading to a lot of aha moments for contact center leaders, because now they can tap into the voice of the customer directly, reliably, again at scale.
Yeah, I'm so glad you highlighted that. I mean, my view of the world is that the insight into your customer has never been more visible relative to these capabilities. Now, let me pause for everybody. One of the advantages of doing a LinkedIn Live is that you can ask us questions. And so if there are questions you want to put in there, by all means, put them in, and we'll try to address them as we go through. Got about less than 10 minutes left, and we'll have plenty of time for some questions if you pop them in there. But Tony, when you were talking about use case, one of the first ones you mentioned was self-service adoption. So how do you, can you give even, pull that dressing back a little bit more and give me, a practical use case around how the insights drove to specific self-service or automation, improvements or adoption. Actually, not the improvements, but the adoption is really what I'm after here.
Yeah, so I think one example that we saw that was really successful was where obviously self-service improvements are a goal from nearly all organizations now, particularly on digital channels. And so the goal, and to achieve that goal, this organization placed a bet on intent prediction. And so, really modifying and adapting the self-service experience based on the prediction of what was driving the initial interaction. And in this particular case, they built a whole predictive model around the drivers for interactions, and got to a point where it was very, very successful, and led to a lot more automated conversations, and not just a lot higher containment as such in old language, but the time to fulfill that intent was way down, because the self-service experience was totally personalized to that intent that was being predicted. But a really funny side effect, but in obvious hindsight, it's very obvious, is that even when the intent prediction was unreliable, providing all the context to the customer service representative was really useful, because it really reduced the average handling time. It allowed that context to be brought to bear during the conversation. So even when the self-service containment didn't work, all of the other metrics were improved. Average handling time, ultimately CSAT was improved as well. So that's a kind of, in some ways, quite a simple example, because again, it's just one journey for a particular intent on one channel, but very, very successful outcomes, but driven by data ultimately under the hood.
Interesting intersection between the data and the agent experience. Many years ago, I ran a focus group at a health plan, and I said, imagine Bob Smith is going to call tomorrow at noon. You know that. I'm just telling you. Can you tell me why Bob's calling? Like if I give you every resource in the entire company to figure out what's the likely reason why Bob is calling. And the supervisors and the more experienced agents said, we probably could get an 80%, just like in their mind's eye, of why the caller. And so what's amazing now is that hypothesis is actually part of the chemistry here. It's part of the automation, part of that
Yeah.
analytics folk that you're describing. Is that a good analogy?
Yeah,
Or
it is. And I remember probably 15 years ago working with a customer, and it was a financial service provider in Europe, and their goal, and they stated it very vocally, that they wanted to be psychic. You know,
is that Big Brother, and does that scare people like too much?
At the time it did. At the time it did. They had to, obviously it was very internally focused, but
Okay.
their goal was to know why a customer reached out in the vast majority of cases. But of course, it was almost like a fiction novel at the time because it was all on-premise systems, predominantly voice, really no data, consolidated data architectures. But fast forward to now, and it really is not that. It's not that bizarre, and it's actually an achievable goal with the right type of investment.
Got it. So one of the other stories I tell is, my kids used to love the movie, probably still do, Finding Nemo. And in that movie, there's a fish called Dory. She has very, very short-term memory. Every time she meets you, it's as if it's the first time she's ever met you. She's forgotten the prior experiences. And my experience with most self-service applications, and frankly, a lot of times the agents that answer the call, there's no insight, there's no prediction, there's nothing around that experience. But the problem is, I think, is that personalization, while impactful in a whole bunch of different measures, is expensive. And so speak to me a little bit around how you calibrate the expense associated with the personalization, as well as what we alluded to a minute ago, maybe a little bit of Big Brother creepiness around being too personalized as well.
Yeah, I think personally, I think the expense factor is starting to diminish, particularly if you're sensible about how you bring AI into the equation. In a lot of cases, relatively simple rule systems can get you a long way versus throwing a large language model at every particular problem. Now, I would say also that you mentioned the Nemo analogy. Like context is there really is no technology barrier or cost barrier now to preserving context. One, I suppose the last mile is identity resolution across channels. Most organizations struggle with that. But once you get to a large where you can identify the majority of your customers across channels, really there is no cost or other technology barrier to preserving context across channels. Like that's a solved problem, and it's really just, I think, in our view, you even outside of Joulica, you've got a numerous CDP like segments that are now mainstream, and I think they're just technologies that customers need to start adopting more widely. Now, getting to the more personalized, the personalization and bringing in, utilizing that context, I would be inclined to agree with you that it can be quite expensive to bring a full AI engine at every single call driver, at every single intent on every single channel. But really, again, that's where something like customer journey analytics can help you prioritize the problems you're trying to solve. Like what would give you the best return on investment? Which journeys are leading to the lowest scores on the critical metrics? And then prioritize those, and that's where you get your return on investment.
Got it. Yeah, and being in LA, I always use these movie themes. So my other one is everywhere, everything, everywhere, all at once. And so what I heard you say is that's lovely, but you're going to need to prioritize and figure out how much of a veneer versus depth into it, which I think.
Yeah, I think so. I like really. I suppose it's a three-step process in our view. Obviously, you need to analyze the current state of affairs, and customer journey analysis is one way of doing that. But it does allow you to start prioritizing things, as I mentioned. And then once you have that prioritization, then you can really get to the really the items that will really transform a business, and that's where you can start orchestrating those, because you have a foundation in place that allows you to build on all of the analysis you've developed. You have your prioritized use cases, and then you can see how you can automate the experience, to the delight of the customer most of the time.
Got it. So let me give you the last word and last question here, which is when you talk to prospects and clients and you're playing the thought leader role and trying to give them good advice, hopefully they buy your services and your product and so forth. But at the end of the day, you're also trying to add value in terms of, good, solid advice. What's the 2 or 3 things you almost always tell a client or a prospect around how they should think about this journey, the analytics journey, the using the tools, et cetera, and using your services?
Yeah, I think I think we always start with the vision. So we like to work back from the art of the possible. And again, from a technology perspective, we're fully convinced that with the right technology choices and right investment, the context problem can be solved. The prioritized customer experiences can be orchestrated sufficiently. Now, over orchestration can be a really bad thing, but certainly there's no technology barriers. And so we try and work with customers then to start with getting that early successes under our belt, and often that's on one channel. I was at an event this week where like a huge, a scary proportion of inbound callers were for a very low number of intents, and there was huge problems with first contact resolution on those calls being transferred, massive percentages. And to me, that would be something that speaks to a use case that's easy to tackle to really drive, increased customer satisfaction, but also huge efficiency benefits. And again, the same customer would like to preserve that context between their mobile and their web assets and their customer service center, which isn't there. And again, but that I think would build on early successes, as I said earlier.
Very, very good. Tony, thank you so much. Tony McCormack, who is the co-founder and CEO of Joulica. Great analytics discussion today and around the journey and improvement around CX. I'm Tom Lewis. I'm part of TTEC Digital. We like to work with clients that are trying to solve these big, hairy problems that Tony's describing from an analytics perspective. And so while we had a shy audience today relative to the inbound questions, I'm sure that if there are questions people have, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn or directly. Thanks, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.